You know, if you spend any time underwater, you quickly realize just how complex and dynamic a trout's world really is. There's drifting debris, glittering bubbles, shifting shadows and reflections, swirling sand and silt, other fish moving about, and of course, tiny insects of all shapes and sizes. All of this is information, and it's constantly moving through a trout's field of view. Yet somehow, trout are able to sort through all of that information and focus on the one thing that really matters: food. Exactly how they do that may explain one of the biggest mysteries in fly fishing. Why trout sometimes ignore your fly, even when it looks like the very thing they're feeding on. At first glance, that doesn't make much sense. Trout have evolved into remarkably efficient predators. They can pick individual insects out of a moving current. They can locate tiny food items from surprising distances. And during a hatch, they can consume hundreds of identical insects, all in a relatively short period of time. So why would a trout ignore a fly that appears to match what it's been feeding on? Or for that matter, why would it ignore other perfectly safe and edible bugs that are also in the mix? The answer begins with understanding a simple reality. Trout rarely have the time to carefully inspect every potential food item they encounter. Imagine sitting in one place while hundreds of objects pass through your field of view every minute. Some are food, some are not. Some deserve your attention, most don't. Yet decisions have to be made, almost instantly. A drifting or swimming insect may remain visible for just a few moments before it moves out of reach, or gets lost in the background clutter, or gets gobbled up by a competitor. The opportunity is brief. There isn't time to carefully analyze everything. So how does a trout decide what deserves its attention? The answer lies in something biologists call a search image. A search image is essentially a mental shortcut, a way for the brain to quickly recognize things that are likely to be food. Rather than evaluating every detail of every object it sees, the trout learns to focus on the handful of characteristics that matter. People actually do something very similar. Imagine walking down the street and spotting someone in the distance. Something about the way they walk, or the way their hair is styled, or maybe what they're wearing is similar to a friend you haven't seen in a while. This triggers a reaction in your brain, and it automatically fills in the missing details, literally tricking your brain into thinking it really is your old friend. As you get closer, they look just like you remembered them. You call out their name, but they don't seem to hear you. And once you're face to face, you realize it isn't your friend at all. And suddenly they take on a different look. Maybe a little similar, but definitely not them. Of course you feel embarrassed, and you're left wondering how you could have possibly thought it was them in the first place, when obviously it wasn't. So what happened here? Well, your brain matched a few key features: posture, movement, general appearance, and then mentally filled in the rest. For a moment, and despite your large and advanced brain, your own search image completely fooled you. Trout operate in much the same way. Like us, their eyes register every visual detail, but their brain only processes a few key features at a time. And then a quick decision is made: eat it or ignore it. In episode 3 of the Entomology Files, we learned about feeding modes. And just like feeding modes, search image is also not a fixed target. It exists along a continuum. Search image changes depending on feeding conditions. And as you may have guessed, that search image is closely tied to trout feeding modes. When trout are feeding opportunistically, their search images are broad. They're essentially looking for anything that looks vaguely edible. Something small, something drifting or swimming, something that simply looks bug-like. The search image is very non-specific, and their search image library is by default very extensive. This is why attractor flies work well when fish are not focused on a specific food source. But as food becomes more abundant, the trout search image and search image library begin to narrow. During what we might call semi-opportunistic feeding, trout begin focusing more on the general characteristics of the food items that naturally occur in their habitat. Here, their search image library lies somewhere between opportunistic feeding and non-hatch mode. In non-hatch feeding situations, trout develop search images specifically for the prey types they see most often. This narrows the search image library to what they've been recently feeding on, or have been encountering most often while foraging. Now the insects need to match more specific characteristics. The size of the insect, its shape, its general color, and how it behaves in the water all start to matter. Here, feeding decisions become semi-automated. Flies that closely match what's in the trout search image library are viewed with less suspicion and are taken with little or no hesitation. Flies that don't are viewed with greater scrutiny or simply ignored. When trout become selective, their search images become even more refined. At this stage, trout often begin looking for more specific visual triggers. The search image library tightens to one or perhaps two of the life stages of the hatch they're focused on. They're looking for the small details that identify the insects that they've been feeding on repeatedly. Only insects that match a very specific set of characteristics are accepted. Everything else is ignored. In selective mode, feeding decisions have essentially become automated. In extreme situations, trout can become hyper-selective. At this point, their search image becomes extremely narrow, and their search image library is locked onto a single item. Here, the visual trigger is very specific. The sparkle of an emerging wing, the tiny gas bubble of a trailing shuck, prominent eyes of a damselfly nymph. If the specific visual trigger they are locked in on is present, they automatically grab it. No hesitation, no thinking. Taking the fly becomes a reflex. But if the specific visual trigger is absent, even a fly that looks almost perfect will be ignored. This is where anglers sometimes experience a frustrating situation where trout are rising everywhere, yet they refuse nearly every fly presented to them. The fly may match the natural insect and life stage perfectly, but if it lacks that one key trigger that the trout has learned to recognize, it simply doesn't match the search image. We can summarize this concept and the search image variability seen in different feeding modes like this. At one end, during opportunistic feeding, trout are looking for broad pattern recognition. Simply, does it look like something edible? At the opposite end, during hyperselective feeding, trout are looking for the precise trigger recognition, watching for one or two fine details that makes them certain that the item is safe to eat. And sandwiched in the middle of all of this are varying degrees of how closely your fly matches the size, shape, color, and movement of the natural bugs they're accustomed to feeding on. You may have noticed that I've been using both search image and search image library to describe how feeding becomes increasingly automated. So what's the difference here? Well, the search image is a set of visual cues that triggers the trout into grabbing a food item, or hopefully your fly. The search image library is a set of search images that a trout is operating under at any given time. As search image moves from broad pattern recognition to precise trigger recognition, the number of different search images a trout is willing to accept also narrows. During opportunistic feeding, the search image library encompasses anything that looks edible. In non-hatch mode, the library narrows to include several insect species or life stages that have been active or hatching in recent days. But when we get to hyperselective mode, the search image library is reduced to a single life stage of a single bug. search image is what allows trout to feed efficiently when food becomes abundant. Instead of carefully analyzing every insect they see, their brain simply looks for a set of characteristics, a mental pattern. When something matches that pattern, the trout eats. When it doesn't, the trout ignores it. For fly anglers, this explains something important. Success isn't always about finding a fly that looks just like the natural. It's about discovering the visual cues or mental patterns that trout are searching for. Trout feeding behavior is based on pattern recognition. And once you learn to recognize those patterns, you begin to understand why trout accept some flies instantly and completely ignore others. In the next episode of the Entomology Files, I'm going to tie all of the concepts from the first 4 episodes together. If you haven't already figured out how this knowledge will improve your fishing success, episode 5 will tie it all together for you. And once you understand it, I can promise you, you'll never look at fly fishing or fly selection the same way again. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next episode.